James Keller was just a lonely janitor struggling to pay his bills, the kind of person you'd never look at twice. That invisibility made him the perfect spy, and it nearly cost America its technological edge in the Cold War. On the evening of October 18th, 1979, James Robert Keller pushed his cleaning cart through the main entrance of Building 24 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The building housed the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and Keller had cleaned its floors every weeknight for the past 5 years. He was 54 years old, slightly overweight, with thinning gray hair and a face that people rarely remembered. He wore the standard janitor's uniform, navy blue pants, and a matching shirt with his name embroidered above the pocket. His shift began at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 in the morning. The building was quiet now. The researchers and graduate students had gone home hours ago, leaving behind the debris of their work. Empty coffee cups, scattered papers, chalkboards covered with equations that Keller didn't pretend to understand. He started on the 3rd floor, as he always did. Room 308 was a laboratory filled with computer terminals and testing equipment. He emptied the trash cans, finding the usual mix of crumpled paper, food wrappers, and discarded printouts. Most of it was garbage, but sometimes, buried among the coffee-stained napkins and candy bar wrappers, Keller found documents that seemed different. Papers with red stamps at the top. Classified, secret, for official use only. Tonight was one of those nights. He pulled a thin stack of papers from the trash can beside the largest desk. The top sheet had a red stamp reading confidential. The document was titled Radar Cross-Section Analysis, Experimental Coding Materials. It contained columns of numbers, technical diagrams, and dense paragraphs of text. Keller glanced at the doorway. The hallway was empty. He could hear the distant hum of the ventilation system, nothing else. He'd seen classified documents in the trash before. It happened more often than anyone would believe. Researchers were careless, especially the younger ones. They treated security protocols like suggestions rather than requirements. They printed sensitive material on the lab printers, scribbled notes in margins, then threw everything away when they were done. Keller had learned to ignore most of it. It wasn't his business. He was just the janitor. But tonight was different. Tonight he needed the money. His rent was overdue. His ex-wife had called twice this week asking about child support payments he couldn't afford. His car needed repairs he'd been putting off for months. The bills were piling up faster than his paycheck could cover them. He looked at the document again. The researchers would never know it was missing. They'd thrown it away themselves. As far as they were concerned, it no longer existed. Keller folded the papers carefully and slipped them inside his jacket. His heart was beating faster now, but his hands remained steady. He'd done this before, though never with anything quite this detailed. He finished emptying the trash, mopped the floor, and moved to the next room. By the time his shift ended at 7 a.m., the document was hidden in his locker, and Keller was already planning his next move. James Robert Keller had always been invisible. Not literally, of course, but in the way that service workers often are. People looked through him rather than at him, their eyes sliding past as if he were part of the furniture. He'd grown accustomed to this invisibility over the years. It had become a kind of armor, protecting him from the awkward small talk and forced pleasantries that others seemed to require. But invisibility had its advantages, especially at MIT. Keller had been born in Boston in 1925, the youngest of 4 children. His father worked at the shipyard, his mother cleaned houses in Beacon Hill. He'd dropped out of high school in 1942 to work at a factory making artillery shells for the war effort. In 1966, at age 41, he'd been drafted for Vietnam. Too old for combat duty, he'd worked as an army mechanic in Da Nang, repairing trucks and helicopters in the stifling heat. He'd returned in 1968 with nothing to show for it except a small disability pension and a drinking problem he'd eventually conquered. His marriage had collapsed in 1972. His wife, Margaret, had grown tired of his silences and absences. She'd taken their 2 daughters, Emily and Sarah, and moved to New Hampshire. The divorce was finalized in 1973. Keller had found the janitor position at MIT through a VA employment program in 1974. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and nobody bothered him. He worked alone, moving through empty buildings while the rest of the world slept. What surprised him in those early months was how careless the researchers were. These were supposedly brilliant people working on projects funded by DARPA and NASA and the Department of Defense. Yet they left classified documents on their desks, threw sensitive papers in regular trash cans, discussed secret projects in hallways where anyone could overhear. They did this because they didn't see him. The janitor was invisible, beneath notice, trusted by default rather than by design. Nobody had ever run a background check on him. Nobody had asked about his politics or his financial situation. Nobody cared. And Keller was smarter than they assumed. He read. He educated himself. During his breaks, he'd sit in the building's library and page through aerospace engineering textbooks, trying to understand the work happening around him. He couldn't solve the equations or replicate the experiments, but he understood the concepts. He knew what a radar cross-section meant. He recognized discussions about stealth technology and satellite reconnaissance. He absorbed information the way plants absorb sunlight, silently and constantly. By 1978, 4 years into the job, Keller had developed a strange relationship with the classified materials he encountered. He felt almost protective of them, frustrated by how carelessly they were treated. If security was this lax, he sometimes thought, maybe the information wasn't as valuable as the stamps suggested. Maybe the classifications were bureaucratic theater, meaningless red tape designed to justify someone's salary. That's what he told himself anyway, during those long nights when he found documents that could have been worth thousands of dollars to the right buyer. He never took anything. Not then. Not yet. On a Saturday afternoon in March of 1978, 18 months before the incident in Building 24, James Keller walked into Raven Books on Brattle Street in Harvard Square. The used bookstore was one of his regular weekend haunts, a cramped space that smelled of old paper and coffee from the cafe next door. Keller liked the military history section in the back corner. He'd been reading about the early space race, fascinated by the technical challenges and political tensions of that era. He was browsing the shelves when a man beside him spoke. "Excuse me," the man said. "Do you know anything about this book?" He was holding a copy of Challenge to Apollo, a thick volume about the Soviet space program. The man was perhaps 60 years old, well-dressed in a wool sweater and corduroy jacket. He spoke with a slight accent that Keller couldn't quite place. "I've read it," Keller said. "It's good. Very detailed." The man smiled. "I'm Peter Volkov. I'm visiting from the Soviet Union, doing research at Harvard. I'm interested in the history of our space program, but American perspectives are hard to find back home." Keller introduced himself. They talked for 20 minutes, standing in the cramped aisle while other customers squeezed past. Volkov was friendly and educated, asking thoughtful questions about Keller's interests. He treated Keller like an intellectual equal, something that rarely happened. Before leaving, Volkov suggested they meet again. "I come here most Saturdays," he said. "It would be nice to have someone to discuss these books with." Keller agreed without hesitation. Over the following months, their meetings became routine. Every other Saturday, sometimes more often, they'd browse the bookstore together and then sit in the cafe discussing aerospace history. Volkov paid for coffee. He always had interesting perspectives, comparing Soviet and American approaches to engineering problems. Keller found himself looking forward to these conversations. For the first time in years, someone actually listened when he spoke. Volkov never talked down to him or dismissed his opinions. He asked about Keller's work at MIT, curious about what research was happening there. "Just basic stuff," Keller would say. "I'm just the janitor. I don't really understand most of it." "But you hear things?" Volkov would reply. "You see the direction of the work." "That must be fascinating." In July, Volkov invited Keller to lunch at a small restaurant in Cambridge. They sat outside, watching tourists photograph Harvard Yard while they ate sandwiches and discussed the Apollo-Soyuz test project. "You know," Volkov said casually, "I think we're quite similar, you and I. We both appreciate knowledge for its own sake. We both believe information should be shared rather than hoarded." Keller nodded, not entirely sure what Volkov meant. "The Soviet Union isn't the enemy America pretends it is," Volkov continued. "We're just trying to keep up, to give our people the same opportunities your country has. Sometimes that means we need help understanding what's happening here." He said it so reasonably, so matter-of-factly, that Keller almost missed the implication. Almost, but a seed had been planted, and both men knew it. On a warm evening in September of 1978, Peter Volkov suggested they skip the bookstore and go directly to the cafe. He had something he wanted to discuss, he said, something that might interest Keller. They sat at a corner table, away from the other customers. Volkov ordered coffee for both of them and made small talk for several minutes. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "I want to be honest with you, James. I have colleagues in Moscow, researchers at our aerospace institutes, who are very interested in American developments. Not for military purposes, you understand? Simply to keep Soviet science competitive." Keller said nothing, waiting. These colleagues would pay well for information about research directions in the United States, not secrets, necessarily. Just general knowledge about what projects are being pursued, what approaches American engineers are taking. "How much?" Keller asked. Volkov smiled. "For a simple report, maybe 2 or 3 pages describing the work happening at MIT, perhaps $200. More if the information is particularly useful." Keller's hands were wrapped around his coffee cup. $200 was more than he made in a week of mopping floors. "I don't have access to classified material," Keller said carefully. "Of course not," Volkov replied. "I'm not asking for classified material. Just your observations, what you've seen and heard, the kinds of things that might help Soviet researchers understand current trends." The conversation continued for another hour. Volkov was patient, never pushy. He emphasized the academic nature of the request, the mutual benefit of scientific cooperation. He mentioned that many Americans quietly helped Soviet researchers, believing that knowledge should transcend political boundaries. By the time they left the cafe, Keller hadn't agreed to anything, but he hadn't refused either. That week, he found himself noticing things he'd previously ignored. Project names on office doors, conversations between graduate students about testing schedules, documents left on desks, face up, readable from across the room. He thought about $200, about his overdue bills and empty bank account, about his ex-wife's angry phone calls demanding money he didn't have. He thought about Volkov's words, not secrets, just observations, academic cooperation, information that should be shared. The following Thursday, Keller sat in his apartment after work and typed a 2-page summary on his old typewriter. He described the general research areas he'd observed in Building 24, the types of projects being pursued, the equipment being used. Nothing classified, nothing that couldn't have been gleaned from reading MIT's public research reports. He sealed the pages in an envelope and put it in his jacket pocket. That evening, during his dinner break, he walked to the Charles River. Near the Harvard Bridge, he found the location Volkov had described, a brick wall with a loose brick third row from the bottom. Behind it was a shallow cavity. Keller placed the envelope inside, replaced the brick, and walked away. 3 days later, the envelope was gone. In its place was a smaller envelope containing 10 crisp $20 bills. The arrangement continued through the fall and winter of 1978. Every 2 weeks, Keller would prepare a summary of what he'd observed at MIT and leave it at the dead drop. Every 2 weeks, payment would appear in the same location. The system was simple but effective. Volkov had explained the signals during one of their meetings. When Keller had material ready, he'd make a chalk mark on a specific lamppost near his apartment building. The mark meant a drop would happen that evening. After the drop, Volkov's people would leave their own signal, a piece of red tape on a newspaper box 3 blocks from Keller's apartment. When Keller saw the tape, he knew payment had been left at the drop site. They rarely met in person now. Volkov said it was safer this way, fewer chances of being noticed. Keller agreed, though part of him missed their conversations. The money increased gradually. By January of 1979, Keller was receiving $500 per drop. The payments came in used bills, 20s and 50s, nothing that would attract attention. For the first time in years, Keller wasn't drowning financially. He paid his rent on time. He sent child support to his ex-wife. He got his car repaired. The constant anxiety of poverty began to ease, but the nature of his work began to change. In February, Volkov gave him a camera during a brief meeting at a different cafe. It was a Minox, a tiny device that fit in the palm of his hand. German-made, expensive, designed for exactly this kind of work. Sometimes written summaries miss important details, Volkov explained. Photographs are more accurate. Just take pictures of interesting documents you come across. Don't remove anything, just photograph it and return it to where you found it. Keller practiced at home, learning to use the camera in low light, keeping his hands steady. The Minox was remarkably easy to use, almost foolproof. His first photographs were of unclassified documents, technical reports that were publicly available anyway. He told himself this was still just information sharing, still within the bounds of what he could justify. But by April he was photographing classified material. It started small, a document left on a desk overnight, stamped confidential. Keller photographed it during his shift, developed the film at home using a kit Volkov had provided, and left the negatives at the dead drop. The payment was $1,000. After that, there was no going back. Keller began actively looking for classified material. He learned which offices had the sloppiest security, which researchers routinely left sensitive documents accessible. He discovered that some professors kept classified reports in unlocked filing cabinets, assuming the janitor would never think to open them. He was careful, methodical. He never took originals, never left evidence of his access. He'd photograph documents and return them within minutes, leaving no trace. By August of 1979, Keller had delivered photographs of more than 60 classified documents. He'd received over $15,000. He had a new car and a savings account, and he'd become exactly what he'd never imagined he could be: a spy. In early September of 1979, Keller's routine was interrupted by an opportunity he couldn't ignore. A visiting researcher from DARPA had been given temporary office space in Building 24, room 412 on the 4th floor. The researcher's name was Dr. Kenneth Hartley, and he was working on something important. Keller had seen the security escorts, the extra locks on the office door, the careful way Hartley carried his briefcase when leaving each evening. On the night of September 12th, Hartley made a mistake. He left his briefcase in the office, locked but accessible. The office door was closed but not locked, apparently an oversight during a rushed departure. Keller discovered this at 1:30 a.m. during his regular rounds. He stood in the hallway looking at the closed door, knowing he should simply move on. But curiosity and greed are powerful motivators. He opened the door and turned on his penlight. The briefcase sat beside the desk, a standard leather case with combination locks. Keller examined it carefully, knowing he couldn't force it open without leaving evidence. Then he noticed something. The briefcase wasn't fully closed. One latch had caught, but the other hadn't. The gap was barely visible, but it was there. Keller worked carefully, using a thin metal ruler from his cart to manipulate the internal mechanism. After 10 minutes, the latch released. The briefcase opened. Inside were 47 pages of technical documentation. The header on each page read, "Project Have Blue, Special Access Required." The documents detailed research into radar-absorbing materials, specific chemical compositions, and layering techniques designed to minimize radar cross-sections. Keller knew immediately this was different from anything he'd photographed before. This wasn't theoretical research or general technical discussion. This was operational data, specific formulas and manufacturing processes for stealth technology. He worked quickly, photographing each page with the Minox. His hands were shaking slightly, but he forced them steady. Each photograph had to be perfect, clearly readable. The entire process took 35 minutes. When he finished, he carefully returned the documents to the briefcase, closed it so the latch appeared to have caught naturally, and left the office exactly as he'd found it. He finished his shift mechanically, his mind racing. He'd crossed a line tonight, moved from passive collection to active espionage. The difference felt significant, though he couldn't quite articulate why. 3 days later, he developed the film and left the negatives at the dead drop with a note explaining what they contained. The payment was $5,000, more than he'd ever received before. 2 weeks after that, Volkov met him briefly at a park bench near the Charles River. It was early morning, just after Keller's shift ended. "You've done extremely well," Volkov said quietly. "My colleagues are very pleased. This information is incredibly valuable." Keller nodded, unsure how to respond. "Continue the good work," Volkov said, standing up. "Be careful, be patient, and remember that what you're doing helps promote understanding between our nations." Then he walked away, and Keller sat alone on the bench, watching joggers pass by, wondering what he'd become. On the evening of October 18th, 1979, the same night that opened this story, James Keller removed those classified documents from the trash can in room 308. He photographed them at home, developed the film, and prepared the negatives for the next dead drop. What Keller didn't know was that the documents were part of a security audit. Dr. Linda Chen had been hired by MIT 3 months earlier as a security compliance officer. She was 32 years old, methodical, and deeply serious about her work. Her job was to ensure that classified materials were properly handled, logged, and destroyed according to federal regulations. Chen had been conducting a routine accountability check on classified documents distributed to Building 24 during the previous quarter. Each document was supposed to be tracked from receipt to destruction, with signed logs at every step. On October 22nd, she discovered a discrepancy. A set of radar cross-section analysis documents, classified confidential, showed no destruction record. The professor who'd received them claimed he'd thrown them away weeks ago, but there was no documentation. Chen interviewed the professor, who was defensive and annoyed. "I'm sure I destroyed them properly," he insisted. "I always do. The paperwork probably just wasn't filed." But Chen wasn't satisfied. The regulations were clear. No classified document could be destroyed without proper logging, regardless of how minor its classification level. She began reviewing access logs for the time period in question. During the relevant dates, only 2 people had entered that office after hours, the professor himself and the night custodial staff. Chen pulled the personnel file for James Robert Keller, hired in 1974 through a VA program. No background check on file, no security clearance, completely unrestricted access to every office in the building. She brought her concerns to Howard Breslin, MIT's Director of Security. Breslin was a former Boston police detective, skeptical by nature. He listened to Chen's presentation, studied the timeline, and made a phone call. 3 days later, on October 26th, FBI Special Agent Raymond Garrett arrived at MIT to discuss the matter. Garrett was 45 years old, a career counterintelligence officer who'd worked Soviet cases since the 1960s. He met with Chen and Breslin in a conference room away from the main buildings. Chen explained the missing documents, the lack of proper destruction records, and Keller's unrestricted access. "It could be nothing," Breslin said. "It could just be paperwork that wasn't filed properly." Garrett nodded slowly. "Or it could be something. Tell me about Keller. What do you know about him?" They pulled his employment records, his work history, his references from the VA program. Everything appeared normal, unremarkable. A middle-aged veteran doing custodial work, nothing suspicious. But Garrett had learned to trust patterns over appearances. A missing classified document, unsupervised access, no background check. These elements together created a picture worth investigating. "I want surveillance on him," Garrett said. "Don't confront him, don't change his routine, don't let him know we're watching. Just observe and document everything." Within a week, a surveillance team was in place, watching James Keller's apartment, following him to work, documenting his movements, and waiting to see what he would do next. The FBI surveillance team consisted of 4 rotating agents who worked in pairs, maintaining visual contact with Keller around the clock. They photographed everyone he met, documented his routes, and noted any deviations from routine. For the first week, they observed nothing unusual. Keller went to work, came home, occasionally bought groceries. He lived alone, rarely received visitors, and seemed to have no social life beyond occasional weekend walks. But on November 2nd, Agent Garrett noticed something in the surveillance photos. A chalk mark on a lamppost near Keller's apartment building, a simple horizontal line at eye level. The mark hadn't been there the previous day. Garrett's instincts went on alert. That evening, agents followed Keller on his dinner break. He walked from MIT to the Charles River, a route that seemed purposeful. Near the Harvard Bridge, he stopped at a brick wall, knelt briefly as if tying his shoe, then continued walking. After Keller left, an agent examined the wall and found the loose brick. Behind it was a waterproof bag containing film negatives. The agent photographed the hiding spot without disturbing anything. 2 days later, different surveillance photos showed red tape on a newspaper box near Keller's apartment. That evening, during his work break, Keller walked to the Charles River again. The film was gone, replaced by an envelope that he pocketed quickly. Garrett now had confirmation of a dead drop operation. Classic Soviet tradecraft, exactly what he'd been trained to recognize. The FBI obtained a warrant to monitor the drop site continuously. Over the following weeks, they photographed the entire operation, Keller leaving materials an unknown individual retrieving them, payments being left behind. The retrieval agent was eventually identified through facial recognition and intelligence databases. His name was Dmitry Polyakov, supposedly a visiting academic at Harvard, but actually a GRU officer operating under diplomatic cover. Garrett wanted to arrest Polyakov immediately, but his superiors overruled him. Diplomatic immunity would mean immediate deportation, nothing more. Better to watch and wait, to understand the full scope of the operation. Meanwhile, the technical analysis team examined photographs of the documents Keller was passing. The contents were alarming. Classified research on stealth technology, radar systems, satellite reconnaissance. Some materials were only classified confidential, but others were secret or higher. Damage assessment specialists were brought in. They concluded that while Keller hadn't compromised entire weapon systems, he'd provided enough information to significantly help Soviet engineers understand American approaches to critical technologies. By late November, Garrett had everything he needed. Photographic evidence of multiple dead drops, identification of the Soviet handler, documentation of classified material being passed, and financial records showing unexplained cash deposits in Keller's bank account. On November 28th, Peter Volkov, actually Dmitry Polyakov, left the United States on a scheduled Aeroflot flight to Moscow. The FBI let him go, believing they had enough evidence to prosecute Keller without him. They were planning the arrest for early December, wanting to ensure every element of their case was solid. They'd been patient for 2 months, building an airtight prosecution. But patience had its limits. On December 10th, Garrett's supervisor gave the authorization. It was time. At 6:20 a.m. on December 15th, 1979, James Robert Keller was awakened by loud knocking on his apartment door. He'd just returned from his shift at MIT an hour earlier and had been sleeping deeply. He opened the door to find FBI Special Agent Raymond Garrett, flanked by 4 other agents, all wearing FBI windbreakers and carrying weapons. "James Robert Keller," Garrett said, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. We also have warrants to search this apartment and your workplace." Keller's mind went blank. For several seconds he couldn't process what was happening. Then he saw the agents moving past him into his apartment, and reality crashed down. He was taken to a chair in his own living room and handcuffed while agents methodically searched every room. They found the Minox camera hidden in his bedroom closet, film negatives stored in a kitchen cabinet, and nearly $8,000 in cash in a shoebox under his bed. At MIT, another team was searching his locker and work area. They found documents he'd been planning to photograph, a written list of offices with weak security, and notes detailing various professors' schedules. Keller was transported to the FBI's Boston field office and placed in an interrogation room. For the first hour, he said nothing. Garrett sat across from him, laying out photographs one by one. Keller at the dead drop. Keller with Volkov at the bookstore, the classified documents he'd photographed, the money changing hands. "We have everything, James," Garrett said quietly. "We've been watching you for 2 months. We know about Volkov. We know about the dead drops. We know about every document you passed. This isn't a fishing expedition. We have the evidence to put you in prison for the rest of your life." Keller stared at the photographs. His hands were shaking. "The only question now," Garrett continued, "is whether you want to help yourself or not. If you cooperate, if you tell us everything, that counts for something at sentencing. If you refuse to talk, you're looking at life imprisonment under the Espionage Act." "I want a lawyer," Keller finally said. Garrett nodded. "That's your right. But think carefully about what you're doing. The evidence is overwhelming. The only thing cooperation can change is how long you spend in prison. A public defender arrived 3 hours later, a young attorney named Susan Morris, who looked barely out of law school. She met with Keller privately for 45 minutes. When they emerged, she looked exhausted. "Mr. Keller is willing to discuss a cooperation agreement," she told Garrett, "but we want specifics on what sentencing recommendations you're offering." The negotiations took another 8 hours. Keller would provide complete information about his activities, identify all documents he'd passed, and testify if needed. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend 25 years instead of life. At 11 p.m., 18 hours after his arrest, Keller signed the ME agreement. Then he began to talk. The debriefing lasted 3 months. James Keller met with FBI agents, Department of Defense counterintelligence officers, and NSA analysts almost daily. They wanted to know everything: every document he'd photographed, every meeting with Volkov, every detail of their operational security. Keller cooperated fully. He had no reason not to. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and cooperation was his only chance at a reduced sentence. He described his first meeting with Volkov at Raven Books in March of 1978, how their relationship had developed slowly, built on conversations about aerospace history and the space race, how Volkov had gradually introduced the idea of sharing information, making it seem academic and harmless. The FBI showed Keller photographs of various men. He identified Volkov immediately, though the agents told him the man's real name was probably Dmitry Polyakov, and he was a GRU officer operating under diplomatic cover. Keller described the dead drop system in detail: the chalk-mark signals, the brick hiding spot near the Charles River, the red tape confirmations. He explained how Volkov had taught him to use the Minox camera, how to develop film at home, how to photograph documents without leaving evidence. The most painful part was cataloging every document he'd photographed. The agents brought stacks of files from MIT, asking Keller to identify which ones he'd passed to the Soviets. Some he remembered clearly, others blurred together in his memory. In total, Keller had photographed and passed 137 classified documents over 14 months. The classification levels ranged from confidential to secret. None were top secret, but collectively they represented a significant intelligence breach. The damage assessment took weeks. Specialists from DARPA, the Air Force, and various defense contractors reviewed what had been compromised. The stealth technology documents from September were particularly concerning. While Keller hadn't passed complete technical specifications, he'd provided enough information about radar-absorbing materials to potentially accelerate Soviet research by several years. Other documents had compromised details about satellite reconnaissance systems, advanced radar designs, and electronic warfare capabilities. Again, nothing complete, but enough to give Soviet engineers valuable insights into American approaches and capabilities. The financial accounting was simpler. Keller's bank records showed cash deposits totaling $23,000 over 14 months. He'd spent most of it on living expenses, car payments, and child support. There was no lavish lifestyle, no suspicious purchases, just a financially desperate man who'd been offered money for information and who'd gradually convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really harmful. The FBI attempted to trace Volkov's network beyond Keller. Surveillance. Records suggested Polyakov had met with at least 3 other individuals during his time in Boston, but their identities remained unknown. They'd been more careful than Keller, or perhaps just luckier. Polyakov himself was back in Moscow, beyond reach. The State Department filed a diplomatic protest, but everyone knew it was meaningless. The Soviets would never admit he'd been an intelligence officer, and they'd certainly never extradite him. By March of 1980, the debriefing was complete. Keller had told them everything he knew. Now came the trial. James Robert Keller's trial began on June 2, 1980, in Federal District Court in Boston. Due to the classified nature of the evidence, most proceedings were closed to the public. Only a handful of reporters were allowed in the courtroom, and they were forbidden from reporting specific details about the documents involved. Keller had already pleaded guilty as part of his cooperation agreement. The trial was essentially a sentencing hearing, with prosecutors and defense attorneys arguing over how much prison time he deserved. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan, a serious man in his 50s who'd prosecuted espionage cases before. He presented the FBI's evidence methodically: photographs of Keller at the dead drops, copies of the documents he'd passed, testimony from Agent Garrett about the investigation. Brennan painted Keller as a calculating traitor who'd deliberately sought out classified material and sold it to America's primary adversary for personal profit. He emphasized the damage assessment, the years of research that Soviet engineers could now exploit, the potential cost in American lives if these technologies were used against U.S. forces in a future conflict. The defense attorney, Susan Morris, presented a different narrative. She described Keller as a financially desperate veteran who'd been manipulated by a professional intelligence officer. She emphasized his cooperation, his complete honesty during the debriefing, his remorse. Keller testified on his own behalf. He sat in the witness box looking smaller and older than his 55 years, answering questions in a quiet voice that barely carried to the back of the courtroom. Yes, he'd taken classified documents. Yes, he'd known what he was doing was wrong. Yes, he'd done it for money. But he'd also been convinced by Volkov that the information wasn't really that harmful, that it was just helping Soviet researchers keep pace with American developments. Brennan destroyed that narrative during cross-examination. He asked Keller to read aloud the classification stamps on various documents: secret, confidential, for official use only. He asked whether Keller had received training about classified material when he was in the Army. He asked if Keller had understood that passing these documents to the Soviets was a federal crime. Keller answered yes to everything. He had no defense, really, just explanations that sounded increasingly hollow under scrutiny. Character witnesses testified on his behalf. His daughters, now in their 20s, both appeared and spoke about their father's service in Vietnam, his struggles after the divorce, his efforts to maintain relationships with them despite financial hardships. A VA counselor testified about Keller's difficulty adjusting to civilian life after the war, his depression, his isolation. Several of Keller's co-workers from MIT described him as quiet, reliable, and harmless, but nothing could change the fundamental facts. Keller had committed espionage. He'd passed classified information to the Soviet Union for over a year. The damage was real and potentially severe. On June 27, 1980, Judge Patricia Hammond delivered her sentence. Taking into account Keller's cooperation and his expression of remorse, but also considering the seriousness of his crimes, she sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. Keller showed no reaction. He'd known this was coming. James Robert Keller was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, in July of 1980. The facility housed about 1,000 inmates, many serving sentences for white-collar crimes, drug offenses, and organized crime activities. Keller was classified as a high-security prisoner due to his espionage conviction. He was housed in a special unit reserved for inmates whose crimes involved national security or who required additional protection. Prison life was exactly what he'd expected: monotonous, oppressive, and lonely. He worked in the prison library, shelving books and helping other inmates with legal research. It was quiet work that kept him occupied and away from the general population. His daughters visited occasionally during the first few years. The visits were awkward, stilted conversations in a crowded room under the watchful eyes of guards. Emily, his older daughter, tried to maintain some relationship with him. Sarah, the younger one, stopped coming after 1982. His ex-wife never visited. He didn't expect her to. Meanwhile, MIT implemented sweeping security changes in the wake of Keller's arrest. All custodial staff now required background checks and security clearances before being hired. Classified materials had to be stored in approved safes when not in active use. Destruction protocols were tightened with mandatory documentation and witness verification. Other universities and defense contractors followed suit. The Keller case became a teaching example in security training courses, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overlooking low-level personnel. The public knew very little about what had happened. The trial had been largely classified and news coverage was minimal. A few paragraphs in the Boston Globe noted that an MIT employee had been convicted of passing technical information to the Soviet Union, but details were scarce. Most people who heard about it at all assumed it was minor, just another small espionage case in a decade full of them. They didn't know about the stealth technology research or the damage assessment. They didn't know that Keller's actions had potentially accelerated Soviet aviation technology by years. In Moscow, Dmitry Polyakov reportedly received a commendation for his successful recruitment and handling of an American source. His true identity was never publicly confirmed, and he disappeared into the GRU's bureaucracy, perhaps reassigned to another posting, perhaps retired. The case files remained sealed. Only a handful of people knew the full extent of what Keller had compromised, and they weren't talking. Keller himself adapted to prison life as well as anyone could. He read extensively, took correspondence courses, and tried to avoid trouble. He was a model prisoner, never causing problems, always following rules. But he never stopped thinking about what he'd done. In quiet moments, lying on his bunk in his cell, he'd remember those nights at MIT, walking through empty laboratories with classified documents in his hands, convincing himself that it didn't really matter. He'd traded his freedom and his integrity for $23,000, less than $2,000 per year of his sentence. It had seemed like so much money at the time. Now it seemed like nothing at all. James Robert Keller died on March 14, 1992, at the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota. He'd been transferred there 6 months earlier when his heart condition worsened. He was 66 years old and had served 12 years of his 25-year sentence. The prison chaplain was with him when he died. His daughter Emily was notified but couldn't afford to travel for the funeral. His body was cremated, and his ashes were eventually scattered in a cemetery in Boston near where he'd grown up. His death generated no news coverage. By 1992, the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and espionage cases from the early 80s felt like ancient history. But the implications of his case continued to resonate. The security protocols implemented after his arrest remained in place at MIT and other institutions. Background checks for custodial staff became industry standard. The assumption that low-level personnel were trustworthy by default was permanently shattered. Intelligence analysts still study the case in training courses, not because Keller was particularly sophisticated or because his tradecraft was impressive. He wasn't, and it wasn't, but because he represented something more insidious than a traditional spy. Keller was an ordinary person, invisible and overlooked, who'd been given access to sensitive spaces simply because nobody thought to consider him a threat. He'd exploited that invisibility for over a year before anyone noticed. The damage he caused is still partially classified. Some of the documents he passed dealt with technologies that remain sensitive even decades later. But experts generally agree that while he didn't compromise complete weapon systems, he provided Soviet engineers with valuable insights into American approaches to critical technologies. Whether that actually accelerated Soviet development is unknown. By the time Keller was arrested, the Soviet Union was already in economic decline. Their military-industrial complex was struggling to maintain existing capabilities, let alone develop new ones. The information Keller provided might have helped their research, or it might have simply confirmed things they already knew. Either way, the principle remained important. Information security depends not just on locks and classification stamps, but on the trustworthiness of every person with access to sensitive spaces, and that trust can never be taken for granted. The invisible people in secure facilities, the janitors and security guards and cafeteria workers and maintenance technicians, they're always there. They see things, hear things, have access to spaces that others don't consider vulnerable. Most are completely trustworthy. They do their jobs professionally and never think twice about the sensitive materials around them. But not all of them. And that's the uncomfortable truth that security professionals must always remember. The most dangerous spies aren't always the glamorous double agents or the recruited diplomats. Sometimes they're just ordinary people with access and motivation, people nobody thought to watch carefully. People like James Robert Keller, who mopped floors at MIT and became a footnote in Cold War history, remembered only as an example of what can go wrong when invisible people are taken for granted.